Welcome to Unsilent with your hosts Dave and Brian. This is not another current events podcast. We're digging deeper, diagnosing, and discussing what's really going on today, how we got here, and providing observations for future generations.
Welcome to Unsilent. We're Brian and Dave, and we'd love to hear your feedback. Where do you think we got it right? Where do you think we got it wrong, if anywhere? And you can do that on unsilentpodcast.com. You can do that on Rumble or other social media channels, and we'll be happy to hear your feedback. So, Brian, how are you doing today? How are you feeling?
I'm doing okay. So just a reminder for folks tuning in maybe for the first time, what Dave and I are doing is talking to people in the future, 60, 70, 80, 90 years from now, and trying to explain what it feels like to live in this tumultuous moment in time. And the guy the name we've come up with is a fictitious character called Kenny G. So if we talk about Kenny G, that's who we're talking to. So I had a knee replacement this last weekend, and I'm doing fine. Everything's going really well. One of the things that was notable though is I don't know if you've ever really done much with pain medications, Dave, but 5-6 years ago, pain was, I think they called it like the fifth. What do they call it? It was like a major medical indicator. Like there's blood pressure and BMI, and your pain level was the fifth, whatever they call those things, right? And so I mean, getting prescription painkillers 6 years ago was, you just walked in and said, my pain's at a 10, and they're like, how much do you want?
There you go.
So fast forward to 2025, and I have this knee replacement, which they tell me up front, like, of all the joint replacements, it's arguably the most painful. Like the first 2 weeks, not fun. After that, piece of cake, right? Yeah. And they tell you, like, stay in front of the pain. You don't want to wait till you have pain to take pain medication. You want to stay in front of it,
right? And
so I'm doing that. So if I sound out of my mind today more than usual, then I'm going to blame it on that. But okay. But they give me a week's worth of these painkillers, and I called the doctor today. I'm like, hey, I'm taking them. You said to take them every 4 to 6 hours for the first couple of days. It was closer to 4 hours and 6 hours. Now I'm tapering off, but the weekend's coming up, and I don't want to take a chance of running out of painkillers over the weekend when nobody's around.
Right.
And they said, yeah, we don't really like to refill those prescriptions. And so it kind of reminded me of how we do things in extremes. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We overreacted by giving everyone painkillers, and then the oxycodone pandemic, essentially, or OxyContin pandemic, essentially, like, hits especially rural U.S., but all kinds of families across the country. And so we overcorrected by just making it like ubiquitous. Right. And now we're overcorrecting by, even if you have a legitimate case, we don't want you to have to do that stuff. You just have to like grin and bear it kind of a thing. And it just reminds me, like, this is just how our brains are wired. And and so a lot of things you and I talked about, it feels like all these things go back to predictable human behaviors, and overcorrection, I think, is one. And it reminded me of the paper grocery sack thing.
Oh,
now, when I was a kid, it was all paper grocery bags, the brown paper ones, right? Yep. And then someday, I don't know, it was around 1990 or 1992 or somewhere in there, that was horrible. We're decimating the forest by doing this stupid thing of having paper sacks for groceries to carry your groceries home.
Right.
Now we're going to go to plastic. And if you use paper sacks, if you're one of those dolts who refuses to move along with modern times and migrate to using plastic grocery sacks, you're an idiot.
Right.
And now, what do you know? We fast forward 30 years, and now plastic bags are no good. And so now we've demonized people who use plastic bags. Now it's going. What do you know? I see paper grocery bags in the stores now, and I just chuckle about these things because we're always talking about how we're going to make things better and whatever. But if we could just stop overcorrecting, like, I don't know, 32%, I think we'd probably be in a much better path.
Well, that's the way that society always is. Whatever we're not doing is what we should be doing. Whatever we are doing is bad. Whatever we're not doing. So if we're paper bags, then what we're not doing, plastic bags, well, we're killing all the forests. And now we're at plastic bags because why don't we just use paper? We can grow more forests. Guess what?
Grow more
Well, yeah,
trees, right?
we can. We can grow more forests. And the big concern now is the great garbage patch. And it's what
Which sounds like the argument to loggers that I grew up in a little logging town not too far from where you live.
yeah,
Um, the loggers were saying, we can grow more forests. Okay, let's not cut down the trees that are 300 years old. We can all wrap
right.
our heads around that, but we can also plant new trees every 60, 70 years and never run out of paper sacks. And those guys were rubes and idiots and whatever. And now we've come full circle. So
Yeah,
my lecture for the day is about overcorrection.
yeah, and that's about what it is. Well, we've talked before. Another sort of indicator of that is we've talked before about how whatever our parents did, we don't want to do because
Right.
we want to do something different. But whatever our grandparents did, that's cool again
Yeah.
because it's not what our parents did. So whatever is proximate to us is the thing that we don't want to do. Whatever is distant from us must be cool because we don't remember why we thought it was bad or why we, aka
Right.
society, thought it was bad back then.
And the things our parents did, we can't just moderate and do a slightly better version of
No.
that. No, we have to completely do a 180 and do the opposite of whatever our parents said.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly right. And so, therefore, it's kind of like that wild kid at the bowling alley. They put up the bumpers, and he just goes up and he lets it, and it goes boom, 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 like a pinball machine,
Right.
all the way down, and finally it clips one at the end, and maybe gets two pins down. That's exactly the way societies work. And
Yeah.
and the funny thing is, of course, it's always worked that way. I mean,
Yeah.
all our favorite quotes that we like to share. The last week we shared the one from Marie Antoinette. Let them eat cake.
Yeah.
And of course the overcorrection of that is okay. We don't like that. We're gonna chop your head off. So her overcorrection is
Yeah.
like, well, it can't be that bad. I mean, they're not all dead, right?
They're not dying. Like what's yeah.
What's the problem?
The consistent part though, so our actions, we oscillate, we do these 120-degree turns,
Right.
like the bowling alley bumpers.
Yep.
But the one thing we're consistent on is demonizing whoever disagrees with us.
Oh,
That
yes.
part we are consistent with. The underlying behavior of demonizing folks who don't agree with us, that we are very consistent throughout history on.
Well, so you got to look at those things you can depend on, and then base your conclusions about how you're going to react based on the dependable human nature. And the fact of the matter is, and this is the other thing that I think is always worth mentioning. The fact of the matter is that human nature really doesn't change very much from
No.
one decade, century, millennia to another one. I mean, it would be so fast. One of the things I think is interesting these days is there's all these recoloring and sort of fixing of old videos. All those old jerky black and white videos from the 1920s where you see people moving around like this, and they're using modern technology to make those things look smooth with proper colors and all. You've seen those.
Yeah.
When I look at those, what I always end up thinking is, they look like kind of normal. They don't really look kind of really all that weird. And I think the fact of the matter is the way this connects is that if we went back to 500 years, 1,000 years, yeah, there would be differences. There would be a lot of stuff that's different because of technology, because we don't have kings so much anymore. But a bunch of the stuff, day-to-day life, a lot of the daily interactions with people were probably not a whole heck of a lot different than they are today. I mean, yeah, they
Right.
were primitive, they did primitive things, but a lot of their personal interactions, I bet it was the same way. Well, grandpa said this, and mom,
Yeah.
you're really just off kilter here. It'd probably be the same thing. And that's and I think for Kenny G's sake, Kenny G will no doubt be, we've envisioned him as a George Jetson flying car with a robot made Rosie and
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. But probably if Kenny G is listening to this on his hollow player, it probably most of the same things will be occurring then that are occurring now.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think I haven't put a lot of thought of this, so I couldn't name off the top of my head, but I think if you can isolate a handful of things that are very different, sanitation,
Sure.
transportation, obviously some technology, communication technology, that kind of stuff.
Right.
But outside of those things, I got to figure how people interact is not that much different now than it was in 1264.
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
People still complain about going to work, and they still go to the bar on Fridays and have a drink, and they still have arguments with their spouse, and they still have problems with their kids, and they still have neighbors they don't like. And I got to imagine those things are pretty much consistent throughout time.
And there's probably I imagine they gathered at the public house in down the street, and they complained about the king. Today we complain about the president, the governor, the legislature. They complained about lords and barons, and so it's all pretty much the same. The human story running over and over and over again, which actually brings me to an interesting thing. I was listening to another podcast that this time in their first interview on this new podcast is Neil Howe, and I
Oh, okay.
hear it's this one's I think they're calling it like the
So for
next.
those who don't remember, Neil Howe is one of the authors of The Fourth Turning, which Dave and I, reference and cite very often in this podcast. It talks about the cyclical nature of the crisis eras we go through, and the periods of exuberance and excitement and peace and tranquility, and then the inevitable fourth turning, which is the crisis area that Dave and I believe we're in now.
And the fascinating thing is, I'm hearing more and more and more. I think this one was called, or it's called like the next 100 years or something like that. And they are literally, I'm going to call my lawyer. They ripped us off. That's because they're talking about, well, what is it going to be like, and what's it like to live now, and what would the people in 100 years think of now? And so naturally, they're interviewing Howe, and they're talking about
Yeah.
the fourth turning, and I'm hearing more and more and more people talk about this on more and more different podcasts and different places. People, there's a sort of a dawning realization that everything is changing. I mean, we see that in real time around us right now. Everything is changing. There
Yep.
are lots of people that are resisting that change, and that always happens in that era. I mean, one of the things that I think of, I can't remember which show it was, but there was one of these shows about the 20s, the 1920s, that is, and they showed a rich guy in that era, and he had a massive dining room table in his massive mansions, probably 5,000 square foot dining room. And every morning he would come down, and they would have all these different eggs in these little egg holders, for poached eggs and stuff. And they'd have them all up and down one side and down another. The whole table was lined with servants that would bring one, and he would try, and it's just this massive opulence thing. And then over time it showed him, eventually the servants started disappearing, and he had fewer and fewer, and then he eventually just had one egg, but he was still in this giant opulent mansion, and his whole world had changed, but because of the collapse, but he didn't really realize it. So the question, I think, and one of the reasons I think this podcast and others that are talking about this are timely is because if we don't realize changes are happening, and if we're not prepared for those changes, then we'll be like that guy sitting in a dark room thinking, where'd everybody go?
Yeah.
The world changed.
You bring up a solid point. One of again, Dave and I, for those who are listening, Dave and I try to talk about things that won't be in history books. Like we don't want to talk about we talk about events, but we don't want to focus on that. We want to talk about like how this feels. And one of the prevailing things I think that of describing the mood is, it feels to me, and you tell me of course if I'm wrong, but it feels to me like the overwhelming majority of the population has this mindset of, if the other tribe would just get on my team, everything's going to be okay,
Yeah.
and everything will be like good and normal, or whatever that is. And I think there's a very small percentage of people who are thinking things like, no matter what we do, it's going to change. No matter what we do, it's going to be a bumpy, because we're transitioning
Right.
in major ways, and we just got to do the best we can. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Yep.
It feels to me that most people, whether it's interactions or things I see on social media or the news or whatever, which I'm doing less and less in engaging in that stuff, but it just feels like people are just like, if the other team would just get their shit together, we'd be fine.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
And I think there's this reluctance, like you're describing, to acknowledge like what we're actually going through.
yeah, and I think what the prevailing feeling of that is we we're just waiting for it to get back to normal.
Right.
And so and like a lot of people there's a lot of turmoil. We can talk a lot about the how the international systems are changing, the economic system, tariffs, all the stuff that we're going through right now, which is signaling a fundamental change in the way things operate on earth,
Yeah.
in a very significant way. But there's a lot of folks who are like, oh, we just got to wait them out, we just got to wait it out, because in 2 years we'll have a different Congress and they can, put the brakes on and we can get back to normal. Everybody wants
Right.
to get back to normal. But the fact is normal, and this is in the other flip side of that is the folks that are saying, oh, well, our side won and this is the new normal and it's going to be great because this is the new normal. And
Yeah.
the problem is both of those theories are wrong. Both of those theories presume that there is such a thing as a normality that any of us can understand. There is not. I think
Right.
the piece about and while we're looking at the fourth turning and how and others have talked about the attributes of times like these and times that Kenny G is going to go through, we don't know all the details, and we don't really yet. It doesn't not yet appear to us what that new normality that comes out of this is going to look like. I mean, there's
Yeah.
possibilities. There's probably going to be some kind of consensus. We know after the crisis, there's probably, but what that consensus is going to be, we don't know, and
Well,
no.
and one of the problems is that, and I'll simplify this for the sake of this conversation. It's more nuanced than this, but I'll simplify it into the conservative and progressive camps.
Right,
Both camps don't have to look very very far back in time to say what the good old days were like.
right,
So for conservatives, they only have to look back, let's say 6 to 10 years,
yeah,
right? Progressives only have to look back, 3 to 4 years
right,
of what the good old days were like. And if we can just get back to that, we would really be somewhere,
yeah,
right? At the same time, both camps can look not very far back in recent history as far as and find indicators that they quote unquote won, right?
right,
Obviously, Trump winning was a big one,
yeah,
but Trump winning could just, if you're on the progressive side, Trump winning could just be a setback, and the real win was Obama winning,
right.
or even Biden winning, or whatever. Like both camps can latch onto these things and tell them that if we can just get back to what we had, we'll be fine.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, it's all way more chaotic than that, right?
And it's a dangerous thing, because if you make your plans for the future based on what you think is going to happen and what you think the standard and normal is going to be, but it doesn't turn out that way, then you make a lot of wrong investments. And I'm not talking just, financial investments. I'm talking about,
Right.
well, where do you choose to go with your family? Where do you choose to go with your career plans? Where do you choose to go with, how you prepare for the future? And so given that, and also kind of what tribe you affiliate with and where you're comfortable. So, there's this last week, I've gotten to debates with people on the left and with people on the right, because in both cases, I'm like, no, I don't think you understand where things are, where we're at or where things are going. And I'm telling you, I don't necessarily understand it either. I mean, I have some sense of it, but I also have a sense that nobody is in control. I mean,
Yeah.
on the left hand side of things, it's like, well, it's dictatorship and all of this kind of stuff, and that's going to come back, and we're going to have inflation and a depression, and we'll be back in charge again. Okay, go on, think that. On the other side, it's like, no, no, no. The president and his team have got it so locked down that nothing could possibly go wrong, and there's no chance of
Yeah.
all these.
They're playing 5D chess.
They're playing 5D chess, and there's no chance anything could go wrong, and it's smooth sailing from here on out. We just have to overcome a few of the bumps on the left. Both of those positions are not positions I'm comfortable with. Both of those
Right.
positions are, and therefore you end up as essentially a commentator without a tribe, or
Yeah, you're a nomad.
you're exactly standing in between, having people yell in both of your ears. It's like, well, okay, well, this is fun. That's okay.
Yeah. Well, if you just pick a team, Dave, like then all your problems would go away.
Yeah, exactly. Well, then you're comfortable until your world is shattered. But you
Yeah.
know, but that to me is a good transition into the discussion of where the international system is and where it's going to be going forward. So if you look at, we're all talking about the tariffs, and everybody's got their view of what the tariffs mean in the current landscape. And on one side, it's like, no, these are the worst things ever, and he's going to bring about a depression. On the other side, no, he's playing 5D chess, and we're going to reshore all of our manufacturing, and we're going to be a manufacturing powerhouse again, and nobody's going to take advantage of us, and there's not going to be any downside to doing all of this. Or take a look at so that's one layer of it. Or you take a look at the geopolitical side of it. You take a look at where he's trying to negotiate. The president's trying to negotiate a peace with Russia, and Russia doesn't seem to be playing along. And they're trying to negotiate a peace with Hamas. Well, so there these part of the danger of this time is the oversimplification of all of these things, and a surety about what is going to happen next. And I think that puts us in a very dangerous spot because we're not going to be able to be nimble enough to respond. I mean, so in the tariff situation, one of the things that people are talking about, and this will probably be lost to the history books, and is my guess, one of the reasons that America is so incredibly strong and powerful these days is because we are the world's reserve currency. We've had some discussions about this, but it's worth repeating. One of the reasons we're the world's reserve currency is because people have so much of our money overseas.
Yeah.
Why do they have so much of our money? Well, to a great extent, because they're buying so much. They're buying so much in American dollars. What happens if they're not buying so much from us? They're buying more from India, China, other places like that. Does that put our reserve currency status in significant jeopardy by accomplishing what we're trying to accomplish with tariffs and with trade barriers and all that? It could very well. All of these things are more subtle and more nuanced, as you said earlier, than just do this, win, move on. It's not quite that simple. And the ramifications, even of success, are not always ramifications that we would want or that we anticipate. I think that's a real
Yeah, I don't remember what episode it was. It was very, very early on when you and I started doing this podcast. But one of the things that we talked about was our tendency in our society, if not, more collectively across the globe, to oversimplify things that are fairly complicated,
right,
and over complexify things that are fairly simple.
Yeah.
We rarely navigate the between those beacons properly. We tend to way oversimplify things that aren't so simple. They're very nuanced and things like that, like tariffs.
Yep.
And we overcomplicate things that are pretty simple. Like I would argue, like gender.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Exactly.
I tend to look at these things like I don't believe I'm kind of like you. I don't believe, and I don't mean this from just I hope this doesn't come across like a self-righteous, holier than thou. I know better than everyone else. I know less about most of this stuff than anybody probably, right? Or most people for sure. But like on the tariff thing, I do agree that what we're doing is not likely sustainable. I just how the whole structure is set up is not sustainable. I do agree with that. I also agree Trump is probably the first president ever to have the cojones to take the tomatoes from the audience and stand up and sincerely try to make a change.
Absolutely. Right.
And I also believe he's a very impulsive guy who's likely to shoot from the hip sometimes, and he's going to miss sometimes,
Yep.
and he's going to miss in a big way.
Yep.
And I think all those things can be true at one time. That perspective, I hope that doesn't make me sound either like arrogant or pessimistic. I don't think I'm either one of those things. But I think that one of the problems we have right now is people are, because of the tribes, they tend to embrace the things that make their people look good and dismiss the things that make them look bad. And I don't think that there's in some cases like the tariffs, I don't think there's any indication that he is playing 5D chess. I think he's being bold and he's doing things that
Absolutely
no
right.
president has historically been willing to do. I think he's addressing problems that need to be addressed.
Yep.
And I also think he's going to blow it in some cases. Now, I hope he doesn't blow it in a lot of cases, but I think it seems to me like the more likely situation is that all of those things are true at once rather than only half of them, whichever one favors my tribe's position.
Yeah, and that does put you in a separate tribe. You and I can have a little tiny tribe. We'll have a little
Yeah.
corner of the
A
bar.
little tribet.
A tribet, yeah. So because yes, it does put you in a place where you're not cheerleading for one side or another, and cheerleading is kind of the main attribute of our political discourse these days. Cheerleading and castigating are the two
Yeah,
primary things.
certainly cherry picking and castigating would be like the
Yeah.
two big ones. Sure.
100%. Because and I do think that there's in a lot of these situations we're facing right now, I do think there's multiple goods and multiple bads that could possibly come out of all of them. So not just all good, not just all bad. I think with in particular with the tariffs, you've got I mean, in the United States, of course, a vast chunk of our revenue as a country is service-based revenue these days, not just taxi drivers and other folks like that, but Google, the Mag 7, Meta, those revenues which are not counted in the whole tariff trade deficit kind of scenario, but yet it's one of the main features of our economy, which it seems odd to me that we don't count the major basis of our economic success these days in discussing trade benefits and risks. Because what happens if, I mean, already Google, as an example, if you take a look at China, without getting too much in the weeds here, but Google doesn't have a big presence in China. I mean, they're using what, Yandex? No, Yandex is Russia, but they're using, or social media platforms. The billions and billions of dollars in stock market value is in the US is in these platforms, in these service-based platforms that are not counted because we can't export them to other nations or to other hostile nations, at least China in particular. So that entire thing is left out of the tariff discussion. How does that play out? How is that going to impact us? The other part that's left out of these discussions is robotics. We're a manufacturing powerhouse. We manufacture a whole lot more now than when manufacturing employment was at a high. That's not what you would hear in a lot of the popular media. Why is that? Because we've got robots building everything. We're about double the amount than when we had twice the amount of people working in manufacturing. And when we reshore a lot of these things, those are going to be mostly done by robots. So yay for the robots. So that's kind of left out of all this. So we've got all of these second tier discussions that don't seem to be taking place because it's like tariffs good, tariffs bad, Trump good, Trump bad.
Well, and the other thing that I think this is the thought I've been having since I had this conversation 2 weeks ago with my son-in-law. Now, him and I don't talk about politics a lot. We don't talk about geopolitical that's not a regular part of our, I mean, casually, but it's not an intense part of our regular dialogue. But he's a YouTube fanatic. He watches YouTube. He doesn't watch TV. He has these channels he follows and this content that's put out. And we were just sitting on the couch in their living room, and he said, "What happened to Detroit?" He's like, "I've been watching this series of videos where they show a house in Detroit in 2009, and then they show the same house in 2011. They show the same house in 14 and 18, and all the way through. And in 2009, it was like a regular, nice, blue collar neighborhood, well kept up house, whatever. And then 2011, like the grass is a little long, and 2014, the fence is falling down and the siding's not being maintained, and then you get 10 years beyond that, and it's not livable, it's not habitable."
Right.
And he said, "Well, what happened there?" And I said, "Well, we had things like NAFTA, and we had a lot of manufacturing jobs leave, and there was Detroit, for whatever reason, I don't know all the details of it, but didn't do a great job of attracting new industry to replace the auto industry, which was a huge part of their manufacturing and whatever. And so all the things you said were true about robotics, and there were a huge, hundreds of thousands of jobs or whatever it was, tens of thousands of jobs that left a city like Detroit when we did the NAFTA thing. All those things are true at once.
Right.
And so one of the things I've been thinking about since we had that conversation was, as people are having this discourse about tariffs good, tariffs bad, I think one of the things you have to kind of settle on as an individual to have that conversation is, which cohort of the United States populace are you thinking about when you decide good or bad?
Right.
Because what is good for Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan,
Yeah.
is not going to be the same thing that's good for the UAW guy who was at Trump's Liberation Day announcement.
Right.
They're just not. And the idea that we're going to have this through this crisis era, we're going to come up with solutions that make all parties equally happy and all parties get equal amounts of opportunities and great outcomes,
Yeah.
I think is not likely.
Yeah.
And so part of the tribalism is, okay, are you using the tariffs and the stock market and the economy and all that kind of stuff? Well, if 50% of people have zero stock ownership because they don't have a 401k in a meaningful way or whatever,
Right.
and 10% own 88% of all the stocks, and another 40% own the other 12%. Okay, well, that's three different cohorts who have vastly different opinions about how much they care about the stock market.
Right.
And so people who are losing their minds about the stock market are like, why don't these other people care? Well, they don't care because they're not invested. It doesn't affect their lives away. Now, I would argue it will eventually.
Sure.
But if the price of Google is $400 a share or $300 a share, it doesn't matter to the guy who has $12,000 in a 401k. It doesn't. And so all these broad statements are made about tariffs good, tariffs bad, and what's good for the American people. I think those are silly arguments on their face.
Well, they are. That's really the bottom line, because you are dealing with different industries. I mean, the right, the place that I typically live, is decries the government picking winners and losers. It's like, well,
right.
You remember when the green energy revolution was funded by the Obama government, and Solyndra got billions of dollars and subsequently went out of business, and all of that. It's like, well, government shouldn't pick winners and losers. Government should be a neutral player. Well, we're doing that now in these tariff wars, right? Where, okay, well, so we have exceptions for chip manufacturing, for I thought one of the most interesting stories, the nimbleness of American business, was that story that they sent, what was it, $600 million worth of iPhones got airlifted out of India.
600
or billion
tons, I think.
600 tons. Yeah, that's 600 tons. Yeah, 600 tons of iPhones got airlifted out of.
What's an iPhone weigh like a quarter of a pound, a third of a pound? I mean,
a tiny little thing. It's like,
we're talking a lot of iPhones.
Like the great, what was it, the Berlin Airlift or whatever it was called. Yeah, I mean, it's just craziness. So there's differences in what gets imported, in what gets exported. I mean, there's so many different layers to that to do, okay, blanket 10%, blanket 25%, none of that seems to make any sense. And so my hope is that it's just we get the PR splash, and now we pick and do individual industries, individual, countries, and we come up with some kind of, because it's too big of an economy to take a broad brush to everything and come out with a good result. It just makes no sense. And eventually you've got to get to the point where you're not just saying things like, we're being screwed by everybody in the world, so therefore we're going to, slap them all down and it's going to be okay. Well, yeah, we're the biggest economy, but if you've ever played Risk and you are the dominant player on Risk and the other three gang up against you, you're still going to lose. It doesn't matter. You're still going to lose. But at the same time, you're right. We have had folks taking advantage of us. We have had unfair trade practices going on. The WTO has been a waste of time, has done nothing for us. And, Nixon bringing China into the world, into the trading, fellowship of nations didn't really work out the way that he had hoped it would work. All of these things are true simultaneously. But we need a more subtle approach to it. Or not a subtle approach. We need a more nuanced. And sometimes I hate that when people say, well, it needed to be a nuanced approach because they're just avoiding plain facts, by when you say that. But in this case, that is very much the case, because otherwise you just take a wrecking ball to the global economy. Now, we are changing. The global economy is changing in very significant ways, and what it will end up being, we don't know. We just don't know yet. Kenny
Yeah.
G knows, but
Well,
we don't.
I think that my hunch is, and it's a hunch. I don't have a list of statistics and data to back up what I'm about to say, but my hunch is that all this stuff is really to get China to play fair.
Yeah.
China's been stealing our IP for
Right.
for a long time now.
Yep.
The WTO did not work out as well as we hoped. The NAFTA did not work out as well as we hoped. Like all these grand ideas we did essentially made Wall Street and DC much more wealthy at the expense of average Americans.
Right.
Now, you can argue again, that's my hunch. I don't have all the data to support that, but that's my perspective. So all the people who are now more of the have-nots than they were compared to the haves don't care about all these things. They're like,
Right.
just get my town back to where it's functional again. Get my potholes fixed. Get my kids to a decent school. Don't let fentanyl come and ruin my family in my town, and like
Right.
things like that. That's the criteria they're basing success on, and the haves are what's the stock price of Nvidia today.
Right.
That's what they care about. Well,
Right.
again, I agree with you that there's not a one size fits all. So my hunch is that Trump has dialed into the have-nots as being his tribe.
Yeah.
And he's going after China specifically. At least the majority of his tactics are addressing China, and I think China has to be addressed.
Yep.
And I think that he's willing to do things that other people have not.
Right.
And I think he's going to screw it up sometimes because he's impulsive.
Yep.
And that's where I kind of get back to I think he's got the right intent. If you're looking out for the have-nots,
right.
He does not have the right intent if you're looking out for the Jamie Dimons of the world,
right?
Or the people who have $2.5 million houses. I don't think he's making decisions they're going to like. I think that he doesn't care. I think he cares about the people who live in the flyover states and stuff like that. And go ahead.
And I think the question is, are the key, the $64 million question, it was 64,000, now 64 million with inflation. I think the key question in all of this is, are there advisors and people around him who can help with all the details and the subtlety of these things? So here's a good example. Where do the have-nots and the haves connect? Well, so we might have mentioned this before, but 50% of this, or what is it? I think it's 50% of the spending happens by the top consumption happens by the top 10% in the country. So therefore, if the haves don't feel like they've got as much money, then the consumption-based economy in the United States grinds to a halt to a great extent, even though the spending habits of the bottom 50% don't change at all, because 95% of the spending that happens for the normies, if you will, doesn't change regardless. It doesn't matter what you do to gas prices; they're going to still buy gas, because what else are they going to do? Yep. You know, you raise it by 60 cents as the draconian legislature in Washington state decides to do, and people still have to get to work. They're not going to, they can't go out and buy a Tesla, and now they don't even want them to go buy a Tesla because
they can't carpool. So they just suck it up and buy less Coors Light or Fruit Loops.
Yeah, exactly. And so there is a connection all the way up and down the economic spectrum. And can anybody, there's complexity theory, right? People talk about complexity theory. You talk about things like the weather or fluid dynamics, things that we observe every day, but are just too complex, far too complex for us to truly wrap our head around and put up a formula on a whiteboard and say, this describes how this works. And the economics of the world and the economics of the US are sort of in that space now. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try, doesn't mean we shouldn't attempt to understand these things, but what you hope for is that those that are pulling the levers are able to talk about and see the things that we're talking about here and now, and understand that we got to hold on to our plans rather lightly. And I think Trump is doing that. I mean, honestly, my evaluation of the way that he's doing this is like, he first said, no, a tariff is the greatest word in the English language. It's a wonderful word. I love it. I
Yeah.
love tariffs. I want to do them all day long, every day for the rest of my life. And then it's like, yeah, we're going to back off on Apple. Yeah, we're going to back off on Canada a little bit. We're going to back off in Mexico. They get a reprieve for a few weeks until I get mad at them again. Whatever. That flexibility, and that to me for Kenny G in the future, the key to surviving the fourth turning, I think, is being nimble and being flexible, so that you can change on a dime, so that you're not so caught up in your own ideology and caught up in your own tribe's statements of faith, that you are going to ride it off the cliff,
Right.
like the lemmings that are falling off an iceberg.
Yeah. Well, and the other critical component that we haven't talked about, we talked about, I think, briefly last week or the week before. We haven't talked about this today, though, is the other key component of this whole tariff thing is Trump has to refinance somewhere between $6 and $9 trillion worth of debt in the next, I don't know, 4 months or 6 months or something like that, as you and I are recording this in April of 2025. Interest rates are, high relative to what they were 5 years ago. And so if you, as a business owner, if you had a line of credit and you had to renew that line of credit, and you could somehow do something that was painful in the short term, but could get your interest rate on line of credit down half, well, would you do that thing?
Yeah,
Hell
for
yeah,
sure.
you would do it every single time. Zero exceptions. You would do it
Yep.
every single time. He was like, yep, we're going to suck it up for a couple of years, because over 10 years, the amount of money we're going to save is tremendous.
Right.
So whether you think it's right or wrong or fair or not fair, these are mathematical issues.
Yeah.
Our interest payment on our national debt now is such that this is not a nuanced factor. It might be the factor.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so you could make the case. Now, I'm not saying he's talented enough to pull this off. I wouldn't know. But you could make the case that part of the being so erratic is to scare the market so that things drop,
Right.
interest rates come down, he can refinance the debt, and then boom, he's off to the races. Now,
Yeah.
again, I'm not saying he's sophisticated enough to do that. I don't know. I wouldn't know. There's no way I could know.
Yeah.
And even if he is, there's still the question, why can he actually pull it off? And that I don't know. but there's so many different very important factors of this that all that stuff just gets lost. All those things get lost.
Right.
Okay, which are we making decisions for the Jamie Dimons of the world? Are we making decisions for the people who have the $2.5 million house? Are we making the decisions for the people making $22.50 an hour? Right. Are we making decisions based on the debt we have to roll? Are we making decisions based on the unfair things China's been doing, how they've been taking advantage of us? Are we making decisions based on Wall Street and DC getting rich at the expense of the taxpayer? Like, I don't know. And I don't know how you would do it with all those.
Well, the question is, does anybody know? I mean, does
Right.
anybody really know? And I don't think anybody does. And I think it very well may be that Trump is the best guy for this job because in this time, because he doesn't know, but he doesn't like the bad press. He doesn't want to be seen as a failure. And so therefore, it's very possible, and again, I'm projecting, I don't know if this is true or not, but I mean, I think it is actually. It's very possible that he does have that flexibility, because when he does something, he throws stuff against the wall. It sticks for a little bit. Now it's not sticking anymore. We're going to pivot and say, we're doing something different. And then, did you change your mind? No, this was my plan all along. What are you talking about?
Right.
And he's audacious enough to kind of pull that off, even if nobody believes it. I mean, like when he said, he made the promise, or he made the projection that I'm going to get elected and we're going to have the Ukraine war solved in 24 hours. 24 hours.
Yeah.
It's going to be solved over. Now, I don't know that there was a person on Earth. Well, no, there probably was. There's probably, 30% of the hardcore base that said, yeah, that's going to happen.
Yeah.
It was never going to happen. It's never a possibility. But he's the only one that can do that kind of thing. I mean, if George Bush would have said that, if Barack Obama would have said that, I mean, yeah, well, Barack Obama did have a number of doozies with if you like your doctor, you can keep it, and you like your
Yeah.
But Trump's about the only one that could pull off that kind of thing and sort of redefine reality on the fly from Monday to Wednesday. And so he might be the only one that can pull this off.
you bring up an interesting point. I don't know how many books are written about this topic, but there's more than one. I know that they're not subtle little books that nobody's ever heard of. I don't have them all memorized, but books have been written, and even who's the Warren Buffett even talks about this. One of the keys to success in business is failing fast.
Yeah, right.
Now that's completely counterintuitive, and people who are not business owners be like, "What does that even mean?" And
Right.
and it sounds completely counterintuitive, but it's true.
Yep.
You throw a bunch of things at the wall, you find out quickly which ones aren't going to work, and boom, okay, it's the fastest way to 10,000 light bulbs for Edison.
Yep.
How many things can I throw out there quickly to figure out what doesn't work? And okay, boom, we're past all that stuff. If we can get 90 of those a day out instead of one a day out, our business is going to grow, exponentially faster.
Right.
And again, I'm not saying he's talented or sophisticated enough to do that. I am saying that it's possible. And if this is what's got him successful, why would he have a different MO in this role versus being a construction tycoon?
Yeah.
This is probably what 40 years of being in business has taught him. Is like, you have to do these things. Now, again, I don't know if that's what's going on. I have no way to know. It could be he's just a buffoon. I don't know. But I also think we can't dismiss how bad things are.
Yeah.
A lot of these arguments are made based on this predicate that, well, things are pretty much okay, and if we just did this instead of that, we'd be in better shape. I don't believe that's our starting place at all.
No.
I think that there's so much corruption, so much malfunction, rot, just you name it, in both DC and Wall Street and trade across the globe.
Right.
Things that the movie Braveheart.
Yeah.
At the end of the movie Braveheart, or close to the end of Braveheart, he gets backstabbed by one of the guys he was counting on the most.
Yeah.
I think that happens in global trade. I think that happens between leaders of countries. I think that stuff happens pretty regularly.
Yeah.
And so this idea, like, well, things would be pretty stable if we didn't do this one thing, I think that's just crazy.
It is, and historically, again, back to the patterns of history, we establish new systems, we create them, and then eventually, because we can't create a perfect system, it frays at the edges and it starts to fall apart. And the fraying at the edges gets closer and closer and closer to the core over a period of years, and then the system collapses. It's just the way that, and it's just a fact of the, in science they call it the second law of thermodynamics. Things run down, the systems degrade. If you leave your garage alone for 1 year, it will be in a state of complete disrepair and everything's strewn all over the place at the end versus at the beginning, because that's how the universe works. It's heat loss, it's organization loss, and eventually there's not enough. I mean, through the early years of the new system, we have enough energy we can put into it to keep the beast at bay, the collapsing beast. We keep that at bay. We keep the edges round up again, even after they start fraying. But eventually it gets to the point, and that's where it is now, across all of these, different domains, so that the little Dutch boy can't plug every hole. There's just too many of them to plug. And and that's why the system has to collapse and it has to be replaced. And you hope that it happens quickly, so that there will be pain. It's inevitable. There always is. I mean, you had the collapse of the Roman Empire, and you had the Dark Ages that came of that. If the Roman Empire never collapsed, I've heard it said that we might have made it to the moon in the 1600s instead of in the 1900s, or maybe the 1500s. But it's that societal collapse that followed that greatest experience of global organization that was the Roman Empire.
Yeah. As you were talking about the second law of thermodynamics, one of the things that popped into my head was, I was talking about the theory of failing fast in business.
Yeah.
There's another that's not so much a theory; it's more, I guess, more of a rule in business, and that is the purpose of a system is what it does.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So China right now has been able to steal our IP and buy farmland next to nuclear bases and like all these things that the average person would look and say, this is not right. This is not how it should be. Okay. Well, the purpose of a system is what it does. So we have a system in place that not only allows for that, but that's the purpose of the system.
Yeah.
The systems aren't happenstance. They do what they're designed to do, whether they're designed intentionally or unintentionally. Right. So we have a system right now that allows for this unfairness to happen.
Right.
Trump is taking that on head on. People are getting very, very rich off of that system.
Oh, yeah.
And so as he, again, giving him the benefit of the doubt on his intent of going after that and dismantling these things that are objectively not right.
Right.
It's unfair, but just not right, I would say. There are people who are very powerful who are not going to be fans of that, and they're going to look for every little chink in the armor of how to enhance the mistakes he's making and diminish the successes he's having because it suits them to do that.
Yeah.
And I don't think we can dismiss that either. And again, you and I have talked about this before. I think we both voted for Trump, and neither one of us would probably want to hang out with him a whole lot. I think that, and I think that he's very impulsive, and sometimes that worries me. And also, I think he's the only guy who has the balls to take this stuff on. And well, what are you going to do, right? So I think that there's so many variables, and there's so many things that are so messed up that sometimes I just feel like even talking about the tariff thing is like it's a waste of time because it's going to work out how it works out, and what am I going to do about it? You know what I mean?
Well, I do
and I have such little information as far as like the amount of information that is true, valid information. The amount I have in my brain is so minuscule compared to the whole. I don't even think I'm educated enough to talk about this stuff. I just hope for the best. You know what I mean?
Well, I think that's all we can. I think that's all we can do because I do think it's too complex for anybody, including Trump and his advisors, to understand. But therefore, the only way to deal with it, if you know something's too complex, then I think you just have to watch it transactionally, day by day, see what's happening, and change your mind in a heartbeat. Fail fast. Say, oh yeah. But Trump's the only guy that I know of on the right or the left that could do these audacious things and get away with it. I mean, he once said, you remember this statement, he says, I could go out and kill somebody in the middle of Fifth Avenue and my people would still love me. Right? You remember that? Well, and it's kind of, at the time, I'm like, it's just another Trumpism, just saying stuff because that's what he does. But it's true. I mean, he's the only guy that could have gone through all the stuff. I mean, they accused him. Is there anything they have not accused him of? Is there anything that they tried to? I mean, you've got Russia, you've got all these different things. And I'm not saying that the man's a saint. There's no but he has. They used to call Bill Clinton Slick Willie because stuff sort of glided off of Monica Lewinsky and Juanita Jones. All these different ones. But Trump has got that thing down pat. So, and that's the only way I think that personality, that sort of public persona, is the only way in this kind of era you could take that on. And the other thing about Trump is he's another attribute of him is he's not terribly ideological. I mean, I am an ideologic conservative. He's not a conservative. He's not a conservative.
No. He has the same ideals as Bill Clinton had in 1994.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly right. The world has changed a lot, hasn't it? But if you look at all that, you need all of those attributes to be in one skin suit, essentially, to be able to deal with the kinds of things that are happening, to be able to a true ideologue in the president's role would not be able to change fast enough when things don't work. So while I would love to have, from an ideological perspective, I'd love to have a rock-ribbed Ronald Reagan conservative. That's not the right person for the day. No. It's just not the right person.
Yeah, and you can't dismiss that you need a guy like you said, all the attributes in one skin suit. I think that's 100% spot on. One of those things is you can't dismiss the fact that when things go sideways, he gets up and goes the next morning just as hard as if he had a massive success.
Right.
Like he just. Oh, that didn't work. Okay, we're on to the next thing, and we're going to give it 110% too. Like you can't dismiss that. And like he could kill somebody on Fifth Avenue and get away with it. My first thought was, the neighborhoods in New York City back in the 40s and 50s where they had real heavy mafia presence.
Right.
The mafia dons were not looked down upon by the locals.
Right.
They were revered. Well, why is that? Why would they? Now they knew what was happening in the alleys, and they knew the bad things that were happening. They could see it on the streets sometimes. They could read the newspaper. They still loved them. Why is that? Because they believed those guys had their best interest at heart.
Right.
And they would have they would give a lot of grace and forgiveness because at least he cares about me, which brings me
Right.
back to my Lincoln thing about Ulysses S. Grant. At least he fights, right?
Right. Yep. That's the if we look at into Kenny G's day, there's probably going to have to be some personality that emerges, a similar type of personality, maybe not the same as Trump, but somebody that can move with the times, that's not so ideological. I mean, Abraham Lincoln was a brilliant guy, good speaker, excuse me, but habeas corpus out. We're
Yeah.
not,
Yeah.
and there's still a lot of people today that are like, I've got a friend of mine who says, why do you keep saying Lincoln was a great president? Well, because he did what he had to do what he had to do. And
You judge Lincoln on the outcomes
right,
over a long period of time,
exactly,
not the tactics in a short period of time.
exactly.
That's why.
And that's what, that's for better for worse, that's kind of the way Trump is. It's not about,
Yeah.
I need to prove my college thesis correct. It's I
Yeah.
need to get these things done. And if I can say, and his ego doesn't seem to be, he's got a massive ego, obviously. I'm the only one that could have done this, right?
Yeah.
I'm the only one in history. And George Washington was
I
good, but
do
not.
still cringe when I hear him say that stuff. I got to
Oh,
admit,
I
but
do. I do all the time. But at the same time, he doesn't seem to live in that so much that it's ever affected by reality.
right.
If he fails, he's like, yeah, yeah, we're doing this now, but that was the
Yeah.
plan all along.
That was
And
the plan
I
all along.
brilliant.
I can't tell you the things I plan to do that aren't going to look good. I couldn't tell you that up front. Of course, that was our plan all along.
Exactly, exactly. So you need a wild man to a certain extent during wild times, and that's what we have.
Yeah. Well, certainly that. So I don't know what we figured out today, Dave. Other than I don't know very much, and we're hoping for the best.
Oh yeah, I'll go with that. Yeah, be flexible. The advice to Kenny
Yeah.
G from
Be
this
nimble.
episode
That's right.
is
That's
be
right.
nimble, be flexible. Don't hold too tightly to your ideology. Hold to your core principles. Don't hold too tightly to your
Yeah.
ideology because it might change during these fourth turning tumultuous times. And be ready to change, ready to be move on a dime. That's what you got to do.
Right.
That's
Right.
that's the message.
Well, as Dave mentioned in the opening, if there's things that we are saying that you agree with, we'd love to hear that. If there's things we are saying that you think we're absolutely nuts for saying, we'd love to hear that too. That's the whole point of this, is explain to future generations what this moment in time is like. And Dave and I can only do that from our perspective, not everyone. So the more input we get, the better for Kenny G and his cohort 60, 70, 90 years from now. And with that, this is Dave and Brian signing off.
See you next week.
Do you want to be Unsilent? Make your voice heard on our social media channels and share where you think we got it right or wrong. Go to unsilentpodcast.com for social links so you can join the discussion.